And our first question for this month is from Kaglar, aka Cartier Tank, who asks, what is the best way for Black to respond to Benko Gambit Fully Accepted? Yeah, so I'm a fan of the Benko. Thanks, by the way, Chess Thistle, for subscribing. Much appreciated. I do like the Benko. I think it's a good opening to play at most levels because Black just gets kind of fun counterplay and long-term compensation. And usually White takes the first pawn. They don't always take the second pawn, but many players do with b takes a6. And so this is kind of considered, let's say, the accepted Benko Gambit. And now, yeah, there's different ways of approaching this one from Black's point of view. I've never been a huge theory guy here. I'm definitely not a specialist. I mainly play these positions from White's point of view and just found them quite tricky, hence the recommendation for Black, because I think most d4 players don't feel super comfortable against the Benko. And yeah, there's different ways to play it. So usually Black starts g6, White goes knight c3. And nowadays, I would say Black has kind of two main ways of going about this line. The old main line is just to take the pawn with bishop takes a6. And we're going to look at this one first, and then we're kind of going to look at a little bit the modern lines here, where Black kind of delays bishop takes a6, instead plays bishop g7, castles, queen a5, and then tries to take on a6 kind of under better circumstances. Now, the old line, to my eyes, is still honestly very, very playable, especially in blitz and rapid. I don't think most d4 players are really well prepared to deal with this one. Now, usually, sooner or later, White is going to play e4 here. There are other lines as well, but we're just going to focus on the main line. White plays e4, Black trades the bishops on f1, pushes d6, bishop g7, and a lot of times we kind of reach this position where White puts the king on g2. And this is let's say, kind of one of the main thematic positions in the Benko, where we kind of see like Black's play here. You know, Black is typically trying to get this rook to b8 one way or another. And Black has play against the A and the B files. And it's just hard for White to use the extra pawn here. It's a very clean extra pawn. If you ask the engine what it thinks of this position, it's going to tell you White's a pawn up, +1. But in practice, anyone who's played these positions from White's side knows that it's really not that easy. There's lots of tricks, lots of little tactics in the position for Black. And White really has to play, I think, a very careful, very precise game to make full use of the pawn. So there's different ways of playing this one from here. The main move is knight d7, but I would say, for example, knight a6 is a different way of playing and totally reasonable, followed by, let's say, queen e2, queen b6, rook d1, you know, common typical play for White, rook f b8, a4, knight d7. And again, Black just tries to put a lot of pressure against White's queen side. This knight can use the b4 square. This knight can also drop back to c7. I guess one of the most important things to understand for Black here is that, you know, contrary to most positions where you're down a pawn, you actually don't fear trades all that much. A lot of times, you know, trading pieces leaves you without with fewer pieces to create counterplay, but the Benko is not really one of those positions. In the Benko, as long as you have rooks on the board, you pretty much always have counterplay against White's queen side. Is there a problem with rook takes a6? Not really. It's just that generally, I think there are some lines actually where the rook does go to a6. I think there are different setups, but usually I think the rooks are best placed kind of on a8 and b8. They're just the most flexible here. But again, I'm not a huge expert, so I can't really get into all the details here. I can just kind of give general principles and ideas. So this is one setup where I think Black is kind of having, you know, this is what Benko players usually want. If knight b5, knight c7, for example, and like, okay, we trade knights, but so what? There's still a lot of pressure on b2. There's still a lot of pressure on a4. And again, not easy for white to develop. So I do think white should still go into these lines. I think this is the best that white can do. It's just not an easy position to win. You know, it's just, I think the Benko is just a very serious opening. It's not really played so much at the highest levels, but that's because black has, you know, many more solid options than this. But I'm pretty sure no one here is at the highest level. So for the rest of us, these positions are fully playable for black and very fun. The main line is to actually bring the knight to d7. And yeah, there was a lot of fuss made around this a4 move recently. You know, people were saying like, this is killing the Benko, but I don't really buy it. You know, queen b6, rook fb8, knight b5. This is kind of the theory here. I think black should go knight e8, playing for knight c7. And once again, we're just trying to trade off this knight to open up the b file and put a lot of pressure. And I guess there is like this very theoretical line I was just taking a look at, starting with bishop to g5. If you look at this one in your database, you'll see some correspondence games that continue like this with h6, bishop takes c7, rook b7, kind of trying to trap the bishop, playing for like knight e5. Now white has to know this move, rook a3, which I would say is very specific. And this is just an interesting line. I don't think you have to like memorize any of this stuff. It's just kind of interesting to look at. But the theory continues, knight e5, takes, bishop h4. And the point of rook a3 is that now if black were to play g5, which seems like it's winning the bishop, white has this really strong move f4, and then the rook is like kind of clued into the king side. And this is actually very bad for black. So black should not play g5. Instead, black should play knight c7. And then I think black is just getting very good compensation here. And according to the correspondence games I saw, black is more or less equalizing. So yeah, I really think it's people. I think people seem to think that the Benko is one of those openings where if you like prepare it super deep with the engine, you can refute it. But no, I don't think that's the case. I think actually the deeper you look at it with the engine, the more you see that black's chances are actually fully viable. So again, I'm not a big proponent of like memorizing a lot of theory because your opponents are not going to know a lot of theory. I think it's more important to just kind of be familiar with the ideas. Here are the main ideas that you bring your rook to b8, you bring your knight to c7, and you try to play against white's queenside. Let's take a look at another line here that I think is kind of interesting. So some questions in the chat. So how should white play against it? Yeah, I think white should take the pawn, still go into these lines, try to hold on to it, follow the main lines from white's point of view. That's still kind of the most challenging way to play it. But okay, there's many different options. Is black always going for queenside play in the Benko? Yeah, pretty much. That's kind of the point of this this development. Like the bishop on g7 is pointed at the queenside. It keeps black's king very safe, but generally puts pressure on the queenside. And then you get these open files to kind of work with, and you get these nice geometric motifs. Whenever you can make triangles with your pieces, generally it's considered very good coordination. So always look for those triangle guys. If your pieces intersect and they make triangles, then your pieces are nicely coordinated. So it's a well-known rule. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the triangle theory. Yeah, Chess Master, I mentioned this at the beginning of the show. This is the opening lab, so I'm just focusing on questions from our Patreon page. I'm just kidding about the triangle thing, guys. That was a total joke. But it is nice coordination where all the pieces kind of aim at the same side of the board. Okay, so the modern way of approaching the Benko, again, this was kind of the old stuff, bishop takes a6, which I think is still fully playable. The modern way is to leave this pawn on a6 and instead play bishop g7. Let's say white goes e4, castles, and knight f3. e5 is not considered super dangerous here because black just kind of drops back, and then these pawns often become overextended. Black plays d6, and white's just totally underdeveloped. So this is not so great for white. Instead, white usually plays knight f3, and after queen a5, black is starting to go knight takes e4. Even if white plays like bishop d3, for example, I'm pretty sure knight takes e4 is kind of a well-known trick. Actually, is this working here? I think I might be getting this wrong. No, this one's not working. Takes, bishop takes here, queen takes, there's bishop d2, and everything is defended. No, on bishop d3, I think black just takes on a6 and wants to trade off the light squared bishops. Important to remember that in the Benko, like I mentioned, we are okay with trading pieces. In fact, we're even okay with trading queens. So if white plays like queen e2 in some kind of position like this, black is actually usually very happy to go into the endgame and play this position without queens, which is very counterintuitive, you know, when we're playing down a pawn. But yeah, actually, that's just kind of the wisdom that we have to remember about the Benko. It's like even in the endgame, black is getting very nice counterplay against white's queenside. So generally here, I think white is usually going bishop d2 as kind of the main move. Black plays bishop takes a6. White goes bishop e2. And now there's different ways of playing this one. Bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, and queen a6 is kind of the main move. And like I mentioned, black is generally happy to go into the endgame here. There was one game where white played e5 that actually ended very quickly between two strong players. Black took on e2, king takes e2, knight g4, bishop f4, and now f6, very important move. Just fighting for the e5 square, and again, fighting against white's advanced pawns. Here, white blundered with knight e4, and after rook a4, black was already winning. I think just winning a piece here because these guys were skewered, and then knight d2, f5 would be winning the bishop. So just an example of how black is, yeah, just like can win out of the opening in this kind of position. So this endgame I think is fully playable. One interesting move I noticed in the database in this position after bishop e2 is for black to play queen to b4. Kind of, I think, computery move, I would say, because we're like playing with the queen, but it makes sense putting pressure on b2, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. And the theory continues like takes, queen e2. I think it's too early to take this pawn. Black usually starts with d6. Now white defends this guy. Rook b8, castles knight d7, and again, I think black just has excellent compensation here. This knight drops back to c7, and then to b5. Black tries to trade off a minor piece or two, and then the a and b pawns are again big targets. So yeah, this move queen b4, kind of an interesting nuance in the modern lines. Let's see, there's also this very, very modern move, I want to say, where in this position, white throws an a7. This seems to be very trendy. The point of this one is to force black's rook to a7, where later on, if black were to play like queen a5, for example, white goes bishop d2 and knight b5 becomes kind of an annoying threat. Instead, I think black should just play bishop a6, knight d7, and bring the queen to a8, kind of taking advantage of the rook getting lifted to a7. And yeah, then second rook comes to b8, and again, I think black has good chances for the counterplay here. So yeah, I think that's gonna wrap it up on the Benko. Long story short, you should take on a6 here or play queen a5. I think both options are very, very playable, and it's more about, I think, just getting a lot of experience. White never plays this opening perfectly. They almost always give black some kind of chance for counterplay, and then you got to be ready to kind of seize your chance. If white declines with b3, I don't know. I think black is generally totally fine with this, like take, g6, bishop goes to g7, and you still get the open b file, and it's kind of like Benoni-ish. There are lots of sidelines against the Benko where white doesn't take the pawn or doesn't take both pawns, and generally you get like a Benoni type of position. But okay, way too many lines to kind of get into. Okay, guys, I'm on a tight schedule. Let me jump to the next question here from Mr. Ricker. And Ricker is asking, okay, very happy about what we're doing. Thank you, Ricker. I play Queen's Gambit as white, or sometimes the Ruy. Against d4, I play the King's Indian or Sicilian, assuming you play the Sicilian against e4, Ricker. That is about it, and whatever anyone plays, even if I am not familiar with it, I seem to be able to respond okay just using basic principles. Should I do more than that about the openings? Yeah, so, okay, interesting question. I did a video on our YouTube channel about how to learn any opening, and I kind of gave my full thoughts on, how much you should actually study the opening, depending on your level. I know Ricker is somewhere in like the 12 to 1400 range, and my opinion about this range is like, yeah, you don't really have to study a lot of openings, almost none, to be honest. Like, I don't think it's about studying the theory. I think it's more about trying to play a lot of games and getting a lot of experience, and then reviewing your games. And so while you're reviewing the games, you will of course learn a little bit more about the opening, especially if someone catches you in like some opening trick or something. Very important to review that and kind of learn how to not fall into that trick in the future. In terms of the openings that Ricker is playing, I mean, everything looks fine. The one thing I would suggest is to kind of choose between d4 or e4. Sounds like Ricker is playing both, like the Queen's Gambit and the Ruy. By the Ruy, I assume he means he's playing e4, and then if Black goes for e5, then he'll go for this position, but obviously Black has many other things they can do other than e5. My advice would be to choose one and stick with it, because both of these moves, e4 and d4, I got them backwards, e4 and d4, there's like a million different things Black can do here. And so if you want to build up a lot of experience facing the different options, I would choose one and kind of stick with it for a while until you feel comfortable with it, and then maybe switch once you feel like you want to play something new or completely different. But I wouldn't play both and just kind of switch it up from game to game. The way you choose between e4 and d4, in my opinion, is very simple. If you like to attack in chess, you like to play for the initiative, you should play e4. If you like to play kind of a slow game where you're just taking space and squeezing the opponent, I think you should play d4. If you're not sure which one to play and you're kind of just starting out, I would recommend e4, just learning the classic stuff. I think e4 is the more straightforward one to choose here, kind of leads to like much more natural plans. I think d4 requires a bit more of a subtle touch and is not as easy to handle for beginner and intermediate players. Whereas e4, I think, is very straightforward. You're putting your knight on f3, you're developing your bishop, you're castling, you're fighting for the center with d4 or c3 d4 or c3 d3, etc. There are obviously many different lines and openings under e4, but I think it's generally a little bit more straightforward. So yeah, guys, if you want to know my full thoughts on like what openings you should play and like how to learn openings, again, I did a series on YouTube about how to learn any opening that I would refer you guys to on our channel. You can just search how to learn any opening and you'll find the 3-part series. I feel like I probably stand by most of what I said in that video. And we also did a number of videos on our YouTube channel where we give like specific recommendations for different levels, like what we think you should actually play. So if you want to know what I think you should play against e4 or what to play against d4, we did a video, or a couple of videos. One of them is called E4 according to the dojo. The other one is called D4 according to the dojo. And you can hear my thoughts, David's thoughts, Jesse's thoughts, and our guest, Grandmaster Eugene Perelstein, his thoughts on what openings we would recommend. Long story short, they're all playable. I would suggest trying different stuff out until you find an opening that works for you, and then sticking to it and really trying to build up your experience with that opening until you either get sick of it and you don't want to play it anymore, or just keep playing it until you get sick of it. I don't know. I mean, either you're happy with it or you're not, right? If you're not happy with the opening, then switch it up. If you are happy with it, then I would say keep playing it because it sounds like it's working for you. There are no good and bad openings in my opinion, right? Like within reason, guys, but there are openings that work for you and openings that don't work for you. And it's kind of up to you to like figure out what kind of positions in middle games you really want to go into. So yeah, should you do more than that about the openings? I don't think so, Ricker. I think as long as you're playing any of the mainline stuff, I think you're going to be fine. It's just very important to analyze your games very carefully. Of course, you'll still make mistakes in the opening, and you want to kind of analyze those and improve on them each time. Other than that, I don't think you have to be looking at any kind of specific theory or anything like that. In my estimation, it's like under maybe 1800 is the level where maybe it starts to be helpful to start learning like specific lines. Up to 1800, 2000, I think just focus on analyzing your games, focus on analyzing middle games, and kind of like learning ideas to play rather than specific, move by move, what to play in every single position. Okay, I think that's going to do it on this question. Let's go to the next one. It comes from Kirk D with the Karpov avatar. Very cool. All right, Kirk says, I play knight c3 with white against the French and follow with bishop g5 against knight f6. Yeah, let's put that on the board. But I struggle against the McCutcheon. What line would you recommend for white, and what are the main plans for white in that position? So yeah, thanks for this question, Kirk, because this is a opening I haven't looked at in a while, and is actually a line I used to play as black every now and then as a French player myself. Now, nowadays, you really don't see this one too often. Most players here are playing either bishop e7 or d takes e4. From black's point of view, both moves are very solid. Bishop b4, the McCutcheon variation, has always been considered to be quite risky, and it turns out there actually has been some new developments in this one and some cool stuff. So the main line has long been e5. I think this is still considered the best move. Black has to react with h6, counterattacking the bishop. White's best is to go back bishop to d2. And now black needs to take on c3, because of course knight e4 just loses a piece after knight takes c4. And if black goes knight d7, then this is very passive. And I think white can follow up like f4, knight f3. And this is not really considered a great French for black, especially considering they've already kind of weakened themselves with h6 on the king side. So the main move long been considered to go bishop takes c3. Now white kind of counterintuitively takes with the pawn, but the point is to strengthen the center. If white takes with the bishop, then after knight e4, the bishop is going to be stuck here, and white is going to be losing the bishop anyway. Bishop b4 doesn't really work out for white. I think there's this trick with c5, for example, takes, and then knight takes f2. Kind of a good one to know, queen h4 check, and then the bishop hangs. So this just doesn't work for white. So yeah, usually they're going b takes c3, knight e4 comes in, and now the main line for many years was considered queen to g4, and the point is just to attack the pawn and then give black a choice. Either you play g6 or you play king f8 here, and these lines are very, very tricky. I was never super happy with them from black's point of view. Like usually white plays bishop d3, or after g6, bishop d3, and then black takes on d2, white takes with the king. It's a very weird position, but like the center is fully closed. White gets counterplay with h4, h5, and yeah, black often gets their own counterplay with c5, knight c6, queen a5, bishop d7, this kind of play. And really hard positions to navigate. Like even the engine, I think, gets confused here. Yeah, in practice, I always suffered on the black side of this. Even though the engine says it's like kind of playable, it's tough because you always have to worry about like these sacks with bishop takes g6, and white's play is very straightforward. So I was never a huge fan. That said, I looked at the database and I noticed that a lot of players in this position are trying this kind of new move, bishop c1. A very, very fascinating move, just undeveloping the bishop. I was pretty surprised when I saw this one, but once you start analyzing, you start to see the point, and it's actually quite fantastic. So what is the point of this one? So obviously white is removing the bishop from being able to get captured with knight takes d2. the bishop would like to transfer over to bishop a3, where it's going to be really strong. Of course, this allows black to take the pawn on c3, and we'll talk about what happens there. But the other point of this move, I guess the more devious point, is that white wants to play knight e2, cover the pawn, and then f3. And then when white plays f3, this knight on e4 is going to be forced to go back. It can't trade itself off on d2. You can't play the immediate f3 because queen h4 check is going to be a problem. So that's why white starts with knight e2 and then f3. Queen h4 is met with g3, and that's all defended. And then the knight is forced to go back like knight g5, and then white can even kick it further with h4. And it's just not a great position for black. Granted, white's double pawns look ugly, but the dark squared bishop on a3 is just such a powerful piece that is just fully compensating for the pawns. So there's a couple things that black can do here. I would say that knight takes c3 here is one of the key lines. Then white follows up queen g4. Black goes, let's say, g6. And if white plays bishop d3 here, which I think is the main move in the position, then after c5, dc5, black has this idea with queen a5, bishop d2, and then very important move, queen a4. Without this move, this whole thing wouldn't work for black because the pin would just be extremely devastating. But black relies on this move, queen a4, where they can kind of force a queen trade. The engine gives white some small advantage here, but I think it is playable. And it actually transposes to a main line that we get from the old stuff. So like in the past, queen g4, again, like I mentioned, is the main line. If black goes g6, there is an option to play bishop c1 here, as a lot of players have done. And then the line continues c5, bishop d3, knight takes c3, dc5, and it just transposes, queen a5, bishop d2, queen a4. So we kind of get the same line. So I think white can go in for this one. But the benefit of starting with bishop c1, there's a few benefits. Number one, if you go queen g4, black also has this option to play king f8. They don't really have to play g6. But the real benefit, I would say, is that on bishop c1, let's say black takes, which I think is, again, maybe the critical move. If black does something else, let's just cover this really quickly, like c5. Then white plays knight e2, f3, bishop a3, and I think white just gets a really good game. For example, knight c6, f3, knight g5, bishop a3, b6, and then knight g3 or knight f4. The bishop comes out to d3. I just think white gets a very active development. Sure, rook can come to b1 in a lot of these positions. That's definitely a normal move. h4, white castles kingside, maybe even pushes f4 at some point. And I think white just gets a great game. I don't think black has full compensation for giving up the dark square bishop. So again, the critical move is for black to actually take the pawn. Queen g4, g6. And here, the move that I would like to share with you guys that was only played in one game as far as I saw, so pretty much a novelty in practical terms. This move, knight e2, which, of course, suggested by the engine. Obviously, that's how people work with the look at new opening ideas these days. But the point of this one is to invite black to trade on e2. I think they don't really have much of a choice. Bishop takes e2, and it's just a pawn sack. But like this is the pawn we gave up, right? This one c3 pawn that was super ugly and doubled. Our center can still be supported with c3, so it's not like we really need this pawn. But now white's dark squared bishop is just an amazing piece. Black's kingside is weakened, and white's just going to castle here, play h4. I was looking at this a little bit, for example, like, okay, b6, h4, bishop a6, h5, takes, king takes e2, g5, f4. Just like a sample line. And I think white just has great compensation here. The engine likes white's position, despite being down a pawn, which is pretty telling. The rook can come to f1. We're looking to open up all the dark squares. Bishop a3 could get into the picture. It's certainly a complicated position. It's not like white is just like easily winning here, but I think it's pretty fun. And like compared to the main lines, I think it's very straightforward for white. So kind of a lot to remember for this one like very specific variation. But I think it's pretty logical. You know, you have the McCutcheon, you have e5, h6, bishop d2, takes, knight e4. Then you got to remember this move, bishop c1. If black does not take on c3, we're going knight e2 here, and then f3 and going after the knight. So knight c3, queen g4, g6, and now this move knight e2, offering a trade. And we're going to go h4, h5, and we are, getting a lot of play. For example, c5, castles, b6, h4, takes, rook b1, h4 is also a big option here as well at any point. But rook b1, bishop a3, I think it's just a very fun position for white. You get this unopposed dark square bishop. Black's kingside has obviously been greatly weakened. Can't really castle without dropping the h6 pawn. So this is my recommendation, and I think this might be one of the reasons why we don't even see the McCutcheon that often anymore. A lot of times opening goes out of fashion because, you know, you look at it from black's point of view, you see that some players are playing this like tricky bishop c1 move, and you're like, yeah, I don't want to touch this. This just looks really crazy. So I think this is a good way to approach it. Pretty aggressive, but that's kind of what you need to do against the French. Got to face it head on. Okay, hopefully that helps, Kirk. I look forward to seeing your many wins in this line. Good luck with that. Let's go to the next question, which comes from Ian. Ian, longtime supporter, always asks good questions. And this time Ian is asking about what's the best way for white to meet the classical Dutch, starting with 1d4 in Dojo's view. So the setup in the classical Dutch being f5, knight f6, e6, bishop e7, castles, and d6. Yeah, this is another one where I think I learned something while looking up this question. Of course, there are many different ways that black can play the Dutch. There's like the Leningrad Dutch with g6, the classical with e6. There's also the Stonewall, where black goes e6, d5. So personally, against the Dutch, I've always liked starting with g3. Jesse did a video on bishop g5, and he's a big fan of this one. I think it's an interesting sideline. I don't think it's winning for white by any stretch. I've always liked fianchettoing the bishop on g2, which is kind of considered the main way that white can develop. And the reason I like starting with g3 here is because I do want to keep the knight on g1 flexible. The point being, we first put the bishop on g2, we play c4, and we basically wait for black to choose how they're going to develop. So the reason that I like to keep the knight on g1 is because if black plays the Stonewall, where they would go d5 in this position, or some players start with c6 and then d5, against the Stonewall Dutch specifically, I like developing the knight to h3. I feel like it makes a lot of sense. The other knight comes to f3, and then this one can live on f4. And I've always liked this setup from white's point of view. So for that reason, I like to keep this guy flexible. But then when black plays, like let's say the Leningrad, for example, then I'll just go ahead and play knight f3 and castle c4, and I'll just stick to the usual stuff. Or if black plays the classical Dutch with something like bishop e7, then I'll go ahead and just play knight f3 here. And now that black committed to bishop e7, I would say the Stonewall is not quite as, this isn't quite the best move order for black. Okay, so let's take a look at this position. So this is kind of, I would say, the starting position of the classical Dutch. I would say Simon Williams is a big fan of this one. He's had some material on this. I saw Grandmaster Basim Amin from Egypt, 2700 player, also plays this quite a bit. And yeah, black has different ideas here, but generally the classic approach is that they're trying to play queen e8, queen h5, knight c6, and go for this kind of like kingside attack, knight g4, e5, f4, etc. So white does have to be pretty careful about this one. The main line seems to be to play knight c3 here in this position. And in the past, they used to play queen e8, but then white came up with this trick to play rook to e1 that I think is kind of worth knowing. And the point is on queen g6, white just plays e4 here, and it looks like the pawn is hanging, but in fact, this is not the case. After takes, knight takes e4, white can go ahead and play rook takes e4. And if black takes this rook, then knight h4 is a very nice queen trap. Just leave this position on the board for a sec, because the first time I saw this, I had to do a double take. I'm like, wow, is the queen really trapped here? And indeed, it is. So this is a nice trick that white kind of figured out. That is actually very important for the whole evaluation of the position, because generally speaking, this e4 break is something that white would like to achieve. That said, black found other ways of playing this position. They started playing knight e4 here, and hoping to get this kind of structure, which I think is actually very playable for white. Knight g5, d5. If you follow the theory here, just analyze it with the engine, you'll see that white is doing pretty well here after this move, queen b3, hitting the d5 pawn and getting ready to take on e4 next. So kind of winning a pawn for white. But then they started on knight c3. If you look at the most recent games, I believe Simon started playing knight e4 in this position. So without even playing queen e8. And I think white can still fight for an edge with takes, and knight to e1. Important to bring the knight to e1 and not on d2, as you don't want to block your bishop. Then the bishop can come to e3 here, queen c2, rook c1, and then eventually white goes f3, kind of fights against this pawn. I think this is an interesting way for white to play as well. But okay, let me just get to the point here. One setup that I think is not that well explored, but I feel like is pretty interesting and straightforward for white, is to play b3 in this position. And the idea is to put the bishop on b2. This kind of fights against black's main pawn break of e5. You can also play these positions with b4 and b5. I think that makes sense as well, but I kind of like b3. To me, this feels very solid. Let's say, for example, queen e8, bishop b2, and queen g6, knight c3. Here, black is generally playing this move, knight to e4. Otherwise, I think white will be playing for the e4 break, either with rook e1 or knight d2 or queen c2, something like this. So black tries to get in knight e4, and then here's the key move. I believe this one is a novelty, according to the engine. So a lot of novelties in this show, guys. You're getting your money's worth, especially those that are watching this for free, which is most of you. Knight e1, very nice move. And the idea is to transfer the knight to d3 and then bring this guy to f4. And the knight on f4, I think, is just a fantastic piece. Obviously, it's going to hit the queen. It's also going to put pressure on black's pawn on e6. And yeah, in general, it's going to stand really well. In the past, I think a lot of players will just do something like this. Takes, knight d2, then black goes d5. And I don't think white really gets much in a position like this. You really have to be careful before entering this kind of structure, because it's hard for white to play against black's center. Bishop on b2, it doesn't seem like such a great piece anymore. And I think black is actually okay here. It can follow up like c6 and knight d7 and possibly playing for e5 or trying to get the bishop out. But I like this setup with knight e1 and bringing the knight to d3 and f4. So very simple approach, Ian. I hope it works for you. You don't have to learn a lot of theory. You just have to remember to play b3, put the bishop on b2. The reason you start with this one is because if you play knight c3, knight e4, then you have a hard time playing b3, of course, because your knight's hanging. So you start with b3, you put the bishop on b2, then the knight comes out to c3, knight e4, you go knight e1, bring this knight to d3 and f4, and I really like white's chances. And from there, once you put the knight on f4, what's the plan? The plan is to go f3, e4, and just build a huge pawn center with f3, e4. So that's kind of white's follow-up here. For example, knight d7, knight d3, knight f6, takes, knight f4, and then f3, e4. And yeah, white's position is looking very, very good here. Of course, the tactics have to work out. Maybe you got to throw in queen c2 here. Obviously, knight f4 is hitting the queen. Black will have to move the queen, and then f3, e4 looks like a great plan to take a lot of space. Okay, Ian, I hope that helps. I gotta keep it moving here and go to the next question. which comes from Steve, who's in the chat. Shout out to Steve. And Steve is asking about the Caro-Kann, the Panov Attack. All right, so he says, hi, Kostya. Now looking at the Panov Attack as a way to play against the Caro. Just getting started with it, so maybe just a general introductory lesson would be helpful. Absolutely. 2 friends who play the Caro have told me they have a lot of trouble with this opening, which makes me want to play it. That's usually a good idea. And FYI, I'm just not that comfortable playing the h4 line. I like being more solid than that in my opening setup. Yeah, any help would be welcome. Absolutely. So I think last time, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, you asked me about this line, e5, bishop f5, h4. I think this is the h4 line you are referring to. And I totally agree. This is a very theoretical, very aggressive line. You kind of do have to know some theory to make it work. Certainly not the easiest line for white to play. If I recall correctly, I think I recommended for you to play the exchange variation, but not with c4, but with bishop d3. And I still stand by that recommendation. So I would suggest this one. Once again, I think this is the way to get just like a very simple game against the Caro. And I would refer you to what I said in last month's opening lab, where I kind of went through the details on this one. But let's talk about the Panov a little bit. I honestly am not a fan from white's point of view, and I'll explain why. Black has, of course, different things they can do here, but one of the main approaches that black can play is, let's say, knight f6, knight c3, and e6. This is just a very simple and solid setup that many players choose. And after knight f3, black goes bishop to b4. And here, generally, white takes on d5. If they don't, eventually, black is taking on c4, and white is getting an isolated queen pawn. And yeah, honestly, I'm just not a fan of this structure. After we take on d5, black takes on d5 with the knight. And yeah, you get this isolated queen pawn. It's definitely very playable. A lot of players have success with this from white's point of view. But yeah, what can I say? I'm just not a fan of the structure. You know, you're left with this isolated pawn. You have to play pretty aggressively to justify it. It's a very playable position. I think bishop d2 is kind of the main move here. And white plays bishop d3, knight c6, castles. At a certain point, black drops back with bishop to e7. And yeah, generally we get this kind of position where white is playing with the IQP. And yeah, I don't know. I've always just preferred black in these kinds of positions. I like the solid square on d5. I've never really liked babysitting this d4 pawn. Certainly, it's, again, 100% very playable position, and lots of players happily take on the IQP because they like white's attacking chances here. But this is just why I'm not a huge fan of this position. You can take on d5. And as far as I'm aware, black is supposed to take back with the pawn and not with the queen. Not exactly sure why queen takes is not considered the best. I guess white gets some initiative here with, I don't know, bishop e3 or rook e1 or something. But e takes d5 is kind of the main move. You can play h3 here and you have a symmetrical structure. You take the g4 square away from black's bishop. Definitely white is slightly better here, but doesn't seem like the most fun position to play. Like symmetrical position, black is going to just develop very easily. Bishop e6, queen b6. And yeah, it's hard to imagine white can really get much here. The other problem with the Panov is the players that play kind of the more theoretical stuff with knight c6, knight f3, and bishop g4. And here there's a long theoretical line where white goes cd5, knight d5, queen b3. Black takes on f3, white goes gf3 because they get some initiative on the light squares. And in this line that I think every Caro player knows, e6, queen takes b7, knight takes d4, bishop b5 check, knight takes b5, queen c6 check, keeping an eye on the rook and stopping queen d7, forcing king e7, queen takes b5, queen d7. And yeah, like theoretically, I think black is supposed to be totally okay here. You know, we go in for this endgame where white gets a little bit of a lead in development. But I don't know. I think you got to be a super GM to win this position. I'm sure it's very playable, but yeah, to me, it's just like not a not a fun position for white to play. So that's kind of the problem with the Panov. It's like you have the players that just play really solid, and this one is tough to crack. And then you have the players that play the theoretical stuff with knight c6, bishop g4, and this one is even harder to get an advantage against. So yeah, that's why honestly just not a fan for it for white. I don't think it really is a super practical choice. And yeah, that's why I like the exchange with just bishop d3, c3, bishop f4. Playing this kind of straightforward structure, you get the e5 square. I think it's much, much simpler for white, and not that simple for black to deal with this one. Like, as far as I know, there are no super established ways for black to equalize. I'm sure black is fine here, but it's not like as deeply explored as the Panov. Yeah, aren't there lines in the Panov where white gets c5? And I believe there are. If I'm not mistaken, I think in this position, if black goes bishop e7, then one of white's main options is to go c5. But yeah, even in these positions, I think black is doing fine, I believe, if they know their stuff. But of course, black has different variations to play, like bishop b4. Rosenberg says the g6 line is solid. I will defer to him on that, as I'm not a Caro expert, so I can't really say too much, just my kind of general impressions. So yeah, definitely check out last month's video, Steve, because I think I gave a rough breakdown of bishop d3, kind of going into it a little bit deeper, kind of giving like the blueprint. And yeah, I think it's all you need to know to play the line. I think is already in that video. I think it's already there. So yeah, okay, let's go to the last question from Neil Kelly. Scroll a bit, and yeah, okay. So Neil is asking, I'm not sure there's enough meat to this question to merit an in-depth response, but I'm deep in the heart of Team Scandi territory and might be able to use some anti-Scandi prep if such a thing exists. Are there any sharp sidelines you recommend learning about if one wanted to prepare for it? Okay, yeah, tough question. So I believe this is asking from black's point of view. So he's not looking for refutation to the Scandi, which I would happily provide, but rather asking about it from black's point of view, whether there are any sharp sidelines that black really needs to know about. Now, here's the good thing about the Scandi. I don't think there are. I think the main problem with the Scandi is that I would say the main lines are pretty challenging for black. But if white is playing for like some sideline, there's actually not a lot that white can do other than, let's just say, the main line, ed5, queen d5, knight c3. I think this is just the main way to play, the best chance for an advantage. O'Neill's in the chat looking for prep from white. Okay, well, I'm very confused because Team Scandi territory sounds like we're on Team Scandi. We're playing the Scandinavian. Now, if you want some anti-Scandi prep, we can definitely talk about that. So let's clarify before I go into it any deeper. So yeah, Neil, if you can let me know. So okay, actually, Neil's in the chat saying looking for prep from white. So that sounds like, okay, you wanna crush the Scandi. Gotcha. Okay, so your opponents are Team Scandi. I understand. All right, let's flip the board. And let's take a look at it like this. Okay, so, well, same thing I said stands. Yeah, there are no great sidelines. There are lots of players out there who'll say like, oh, you should play e5 here, which is not a good move, or you should play knight c3 here, which allows black to equalize very easily in a number of ways. I'm not a fan of any of these moves. I think you should just go to the heart of the matter, take on d5, get your free tempo with knight c3, and well, yeah, okay, there's different lines. There's queen a5, queen d6, queen d8. All of them are pretty popular these days, actually. So there's kind of like three main variations you have to deal with. Against queen a5, which I would say, okay, the most popular one, I am a fan of, let's say, playing d4. Black usually goes knight f6 and knight f3. And okay, there's different ways black can develop here. So there's, yeah, lots of little lines. I don't want to get into it too much because I don't think you need to know a bunch of theory here. Let me just show you a couple of ideas. If black plays bishop g4, for example, which I think is very common, I think you should immediately challenge this with h3. Black takes on f3, you take with the queen, you have the two bishops. I would say these positions, not exactly easy to handle, but white does get an edge here. Actually, I have recorded a video on YouTube where I analyze a game from Dor, actually. It was in the chat. Mitch versus Dor. In that game, the queen went to d8, but we had a similar exchange. Bishop takes f3, queen takes f3. And in that video, I talk specifically about how white should kind of fight for an advantage. Long story short, you have the two bishops here. You're doing well. You should develop your bishops at some point, probably castle queenside, play g4, g5, and go for this play. Most players, though, are not going to be taking on f3. They're usually going to be playing bishop h5. And here is where I want you to play g4 and knight e5. I think this is a pretty fun approach from white's point of view. And there's kind of two ideas here that you should know about. Number one, you're trying to play h4 and h5 and just trap the bishop, right? So if black, let's say, plays some random move, let's say e6, then you're going h4, and your idea is to chase the bishop with h5. Black really doesn't want to play h6 because then you're taking on g6 and ruining their structure, and this is really bad for black's light squares. Of course, they can get the bishop out with bishop e4, but now we're getting into the theory, and I don't think you really need to know a whole lot here. It's a fun and aggressive way for white to play. I think you should just jump into it head first and then analyze your games once you get here. The other idea of this move, knight e5, that you should keep in mind is that this knight can jump to c4 and harass black's queen. So if black does not play this move e6, play something like knight d7, then knight c4 is actually very annoying for black to deal with. Queen is like almost trapped. Queen b4, we have a3. Queen has to go to a6. And now after this move, bishop f4, threatening knight d6 check, which just wins the queen on the spot. So this is super dangerous for black. Again, the queen has to move with like queen e6 check or queen c6. Queen c6, we just have d5. And this queen is just in, again, huge trouble. Queen e6, I think we just go knight e3 here. And yeah, I just love white's position. I hate black's position. The bishop on f8 is terrible. And yeah, we just have great development here. Bishop g2, d5 coming, queen d2, castles queenside. So these are the two ideas white should kind of know in this line. Number one, we're playing for h4. Number two, if black doesn't play e6, playing for knight c4. Here, knight c4 doesn't work, I'll just quickly mention, because after bishop f4, queen c6 hits the rook, and we don't have this key move, d5. So instead, I think white should just continue with the main plan, h4, h5, and playing against black's bishop. If knight d7 here, for example, you just take on d7, and after, let's say, knight d7, h5, the bishop has to go to e4, for example. And yeah, I think this is a nice position for white. You can go rook h3, you can go f3. I think white gets pretty decent chances here. So yeah, Neil, I hope this helps. I don't think you have to know a ton of theory. I understand these lines are very popular. The main thing is just to analyze your games. Try to play something aggressive. You know, this move, bishop c4, is also considered pretty good, followed by bishop d2. Very solid setup. Queen e2, and then white castles queenside. Lots of ways to play against the Scandi, but the important thing is just analyze your games, learn from your games, and you'll see the chances that you should be aiming for. There are other lines in the Scandi, of course, but yeah, I don't want to get into it now. I think I'm gonna do a video on the Scandi at some point, just kind of highlighting these details and more, like how to play against it. But yeah, for now, I think we're just gonna stick it leave it at this. Knight f3, knight c3, h3, g4, bishop c4, bishop d2. And yeah, you should be good. Analyze your games. Okay, guys, I'm going to wrap it up here. I have a US Chess School lecture coming up in 15 minutes, so I got to go get set up for that. That'll be starting, like I mentioned, in 15 minutes. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the opening lab, got some use out of it. The whole thing has been recorded, obviously. It'll be in the VODs. We're going to put it up on YouTube as well. And yeah, this is a show. Once again, we do this once a month for our Patreon members. They get to submit questions. I do a little bit of research and I come up with some recommendations. And sometimes we learn some good stuff. I mean, I introduced a couple of big novelties in this one. So it was pretty, I think it was a pretty fun show. Yeah. Okay, guys, gonna go on break here. I'll be back in a bit with the US Chess School. Won't be interacting with chat so much for that one. I'm just gonna be focusing on teaching the class. But as always, you guys are welcome to hang out and hopefully learn something. So yeah, we'll be seeing you guys in a little bit.